Hi, BookStory viewers. My name is Gabriel Hunter Chang. I'm here with David Hanna. He is a history teacher at Stuyvesant High School in New York and an adjunct instructor at NYU. He is also the author of this book, Rendezvous with Death, the Americans who joined the Foreign Legion in 1914 to fight for France and for civilization. So the book is fairly straightforward in its structure. It follows this group of volunteers, American volunteers who fought for France before the United States entered the war in 1917. And it follows them in line through battles and even into the early French Air Force that was developing in World War I. So one thing that, David, one thing that struck me about the book is that one of the main themes is really the creation and power of symbols. You've got this France as a symbol of civilization for these volunteers. You've got the volunteers themselves symbolizing different things to France, to the United States, who was unsure about entering the war, and even to Germany, who saw it perhaps as a mark of American involvement in the war. And then you also have maybe these volunteers just potential to signal something to historians looking back on World War I today. So my question for you is this a reading of the book that you agree with? And does it perhaps touch on one of your motivations for writing the book?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. The Americans that volunteered to serve in 1914, they felt instinctively that the United States was for one thing, it had a kindred country, a republic like France, but they also felt that the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm represented something new and disturbing, in that it was a combination of the both the idea of might makes right on the one hand, trying to use their military to essentially create a hegemonic situation in Europe if they could. From their perspective, of course, they felt they were being encircled, but to some degree, that was really all in their own mind. But that of course, is what the perception that they had. But also, on the one hand, this, and then on the other hand, that France represented these civilizational values that they felt that the United States shared with France, and these were things that we say, I guess we could say, liberal values, art, culture, democracy. And that Germany was essentially trying to force the issue, and they felt Germany was a bully. And I think to some degree they were correct. I mean, a lot of ink has been spilled about the causes of the war. It's one of these topics that's just endlessly fascinating. I think that 100 years from now, I think people are still going to be writing about the causes of the war. But I think that Germany did want the war, and they wanted it in order to break out of this perception of being encircled, and that France was in the way. And they knew that they had to be able to sort of force France to heel in order to create the kind of situation that they wanted in Europe. And France was, a proud nation, and they were going to defend their country, and they were willing to take just about anybody that was willing to serve, and these Americans were eager. And the French Foreign Legion was a vehicle for that. It enabled them to join the fight without having to renounce their citizenship. It was a way of sort of skirting this. And the Germans were not very happy about this, but it was something that, and again, enabled the Americans to get involved.
Right. Yeah. And you touched on something that I found really interesting in the book, which is the idea that Germany was really kind of a primary aggressor or instigator of the war, which was surprising to me because, I mean, in my own school experience, it was very much explained, like, I guess in the theory that you touch on to debunk or to challenge, that everybody was sort of responsible for the war equally. I'm curious, and you talk about this a little bit, how did that narrative come about? Why did it come about? And why do you feel so strongly that it was really primarily Germany?
Well, the thing is that after the war, initially there was a lot of the blame Germany. Of course, if you look at the Versailles Treaty, it's very unfair. It's certainly understandable why Germans would have felt that they had gotten a raw deal, considering that they were still the army was still intact. It was on French soil, retreated in good order. But of course, they didn't know and even statesmen at the time weren't aware of a lot of the machinations within the German high command and the circles around the Kaiser before the war. And it was later, with the work of Fritz Fischer, a German historian who had access actually to archives that were behind the Iron Curtain at that time. This was during the Cold War later. And some of these were pretty damning in terms of Germany looking for the right opportunity and not wanting to be an out-and-out aggressor, and also trying to prepare public opinion for war, particularly with Russia, which is interesting because the initial isolation diplomatically of France was a priority for the Germans. And then when they made an alliance with Russia, after the reinsurance treaty was allowed to lapse between the Germans and the Russians in the early 1890s, it was a way for France to break out of that isolation. But what ultimately happened was that the Russians became the bigger threat in the German mind. And they anticipated the Russians by 1920, militarily, with the modernization of their military, to be it would have been beyond their reach to defeat a combination of Russia and France, possibly backed by the Royal Navy. They were hoping that the British wouldn't come in, and so they felt that their window was rather small. And then there's this other concept, and this is something that not only Fischer but a number of other historians have explored, this idea of both the foreign policy, Weltpolitik, and then the Primat der Innenpolitik, the domestic policy. And the latter, in some ways, is even more important because it enabled the Germans to, by having a war that would rally everyone around the colors, unite the country, it would enable this very conservative clique at the top that was really calling the shots and had been since the Constitution had been written earlier in the 19th century for a united German Reich, to reassert their dominance over the situation that they were starting to lose control over, because domestic politics in Germany were moving towards the left. It was a wealthy, progressive country in terms of its technology, its access to, a lot of ideas and of course certainly in science. And so that to have an almost feudal clique running the country when it was just incongruous. But the war was a way to also sort of head that off. And so what happened with the assassination, of course, of Franz Ferdinand was an opportunity, because the Austrians were looking for an opportunity themselves to deal with the rump Serb state that they sort of laid a lot of the blame on. But they couldn't do that, of course, without bringing in Russia. I mean, at least not realistically. But with Germany's full backing, that enabled them to be much more bold than they would have been otherwise. And Germany, you could look at what happened with the July 5th meeting in 1914 and argue that they were reckless. They hadn't really thought it through. But I think that underestimates the Germans. I think that they knew full well what they were doing, and I think the evidence points in that direction. And again, from their perspective, it made some sense. It wasn't aggression just for aggression's sake. They did feel they were being encircled, and those at the top wanted to maintain the order that they had imposed inside Germany and then the order that they wanted to impose outside Germany, which would have been Germany essentially dominant on the continent. Again, I think that the idea that it was collective, also, that was as the initial bad feelings after the war subsided, it was in everybody's interest to sort of think of it as collective guilt, because they wanted to move on. And part of course, of World War II was a rehashing of a lot of this. That was something that Adolf Hitler found was very fertile ground politically for him inside Germany. But again, if we're all essentially collectively guilty for what happened in terms of imperialism and militarism and so forth, and not really being careful enough in our diplomacy, then it was less uncomfortable, for lack of a better way of putting it. But again, if you look at Fischer's work, I think it's pretty conclusive.
Yeah, it's a really compelling argument, and I'm glad that it came up in the book. And I also thought it was interesting the way that you found to tell it. Rather than writing sort of maybe a drier sort of like laying out the facts, laying out the reasons. You really, I think, maybe showed it through the volunteers that you focused on and that you focused the book through. And so moving back to them, I'm kind of curious how I mean, it was a small group. I think you said maybe about 50 or so American volunteers. And within that, you really focused on maybe like 5 to 10 primarily. And I'm curious how you came to pick those ones. Especially Alan Seeger was, I think, one of my favorite characters, and perhaps maybe the main protagonist of the book.
Yeah, Seeger's a really interesting guy. In many ways, he's very contemporary, I think. Well, in terms of the numbers, about 50 is because there were the U.S. So in terms of being a U.S. national, it was a little dubious with some of the guys that identified themselves as Americans. There were some who actually had friends who were Americans and just sort of threw in their lot with them, and so it's not exactly it's a little bit unclear about who was an American and who wasn't. Not all of them. Some of them clearly were, but it was a little dubious. Anyway, that aside, in terms of those that I focused on, it was Seeger because his poems and letters and diary had been published actually during the war, after his death. Kiffin Rockwell's letters were published, and then there was a memoir in history written by his brother, who also served with him in the first part of the war before he he injured his arm and wasn't able to carry a pack or a rifle and had to step out. There was Bob Scanlon and William Thaw, who did not leave behind voluminous letters or a journal, but they stood out as such larger-than-life characters for different reasons that I felt that they were two that I wanted to feature. Then there was John Bow, who was in his late 40s, father of 4, when he went to join this fight. I'm 51, and it just boggles the mind. I can't imagine having that conversation with my wife. And so Bow was one of the. He had written a memoir, actually, right in 1918, right as the war was ending. And then David King, he wrote a memoir about 10 years later, and I thought it was very powerful, particularly his account of Verdun. He was there not with the Foreign Legion, but with the 170th Regiment, and then of course, lastly, Paul Rockwell, and then Victor Chapman. Victor Chapman also, whose letters were published by his father during the war. So that's the core material. It's them speaking for themselves, and then in the case of Paul Rockwell, he's sort of the historian for the entire group, and it was also in his case because he experienced much of it, my memoir too. And so that's sort of the core. And then looking at some of the histories of the Legion, for instance, was important. And lastly, periodicals, both from the U.S. and from France at the time, because they got people's attention. And that was their intention to a large degree, particularly later on once the squadron was formed that became the Lafayette Escadrille. They wanted press attention. But yes, that was the core. And Seeger, his poems are, he was just coming into his own as a poet. He was recognized as such at the time, and they're moving. And it's also one of the things that I found really fascinating about this was when I was a student, and probably similar to yourself, I was familiar with poets like, for instance, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and the really rich sort of tradition of British war poetry that particularly came out of the war, and it was very disillusioned with the war. And I certainly can see why the British soldiers were, given what happened in the war and some of the decisions by the high command. But that aside, what was interesting to me is that I found hardly a hint of disillusionment on the part of these American volunteers. It really isn't there. I mean, there were complaints about, I haven't eaten in 2 days, or I want to brain the non-commissioned officer that keeps, hounding me, or whatever it might be. I mean, but in terms of that larger existential sort of, angst, I didn't find it, and I was surprised, because these were educated men for the most part, and they were in the thick of it. I mean, they had ample opportunity to, reflect on the absurdity of the war, and to sort of feel, well, gosh, maybe I was wrong here. Maybe this was not as clear cut as I had thought. But again, I didn't find that, and that surprised me. And it, Seeger, the thing about Seeger is that if you look at his poetry, he can come across as, sort of maybe a bit naive in some ways, but then when you look at what he was involved in, he wasn't. It's not because he was ill-informed. He had been in the thick of it, and he felt that it was worthy. And he even saw beauty, not so much in the killing, but in the French countryside and what he was experiencing. He was still able to sort of step out of himself and have this perspective. And this goes back to his youth in Mexico, when he early on was able to demonstrate this ability to sort of to paint a picture for someone. It was like painting with words. Chapman also had a gift with words too. He wasn't a poet, but some of the things he wrote about flying, just beautiful. So yes, those 7 really are the main figures, and they're also they cut across sort of social, geographic, racial lines, age. So they're sort of a cross section of Americans at that time, and that was the other reason why I decided to focus on them primarily, but not exclusively.
Yeah, I thought, especially the bit where they're talking, where you talk about them interacting with the, especially like early in the war, with the members of the French Foreign Legion who had been there, and there's kind of this divide that you talk about with like the idealism of the new American volunteers and the sort of rough or rugged pragmatism of the existing. Yeah, so I guess that leads to another sort of the main claims that I saw in the book, which I thought was really interesting, about how these volunteers in many ways played a pretty big role in bringing and influencing U.S. popular opinion, and perhaps even in bringing the United States into the war. And I was curious, to what extent were they actually sort of responsible for that? And especially if you break it down into, Alan Seeger, and his writings and his apparent celebrity back in the United States, as well as the Escadrille Américaine and the extent to which they became sort of heroes internationally. I guess, yeah.
Well, again, they were aware that they were really, I mean, the French High Command, they recognized the potential value of the Americans early on, because the industrial and military potential of the United States, their home country, was enormous. And if that could ever be brought to bear in the war on the Allied side, it could make all the difference, which arguably it ultimately did. So that calculation was made early, and the Americans understood this. And some of them were making a conscious effort to reach out to people at home. For instance, Seeger was writing articles for the New York Sun. There were others that were writing, articles, or had a correspondence with newspapers back home. And also, you had some that were very prominent, or from very prominent families. People like William Thaw and Victor Chapman, David King. These were scions of very wealthy, well-connected families that had a lot of influence back in the United States. And the fact that they were putting themselves on the line, and they were. I mean, this was not a gesture. This was real. It had an effect, but again, it's incremental, because the thing is that Woodrow Wilson, who their view of him was generally, with really one exception I can think of, was generally sort of puzzled, like, why can't you see what we see? It seems so obvious to us, to downright hostile, Seeger in particular. And you have to understand, they had grown up in America, sort of come of age when Theodore Roosevelt was president. And he was this larger than life figure, this progressive, this very sort of ultra-nationalist in foreign affairs and so forth, very muscular foreign policy. And so that was sort of their model. And Roosevelt, of course, was still very much politically active and really pressing Wilson. But Wilson was on firm ground, because the United States, there's no precedent for U.S. intervention in European affairs, going back to Washington's farewell address. So the idea that, sort of, when we look at it from the vantage point of 2018, we think of U.S. intervention in World War I, then in World War II, and then, of course, the presence in Europe after the war that's been maintained really actually to the present. But that's an anomaly, or was an anomaly in U.S. history, certainly in 1914. And so it had to be incremental. It's not something, if anything would have done it, it would have been the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. But that Wilson was not ready and to do it, and he was not going to let himself be pushed into the war. But again, incrementally, and then, of course, this Lafayette, what became the Lafayette Escadrille, the Escadrille Américaine initially, N124, was wonderful, because that was, the trenches that was something people just couldn't grasp. It was just so grim. But the fighting in the skies with these aircraft with the colorful insignia and these really romantic figures, and that was something people could seize on, and that was something they could get excited about. And these were you had Kiffin Rockwell, for instance, who was a Carolinian, right? Chapman was from the Hudson Valley, Thal was from Pittsburgh, and so forth. And those in America who wanted the United States to intervene, and of course the French, they were always sort of cultivating the press to try to get stories out. There was even a newsreel early on. I wrote about it obliquely in the book. Caused some bad feelings, because some of them didn't like they felt that they were almost like I don't know if a circus show that's a bit much, but that it was too much of a publicity stunt, and they felt that sort of it demeaned what they were doing to some degree. But in the larger sense, it was the correct move, because those, for instance, that newsreel, which is still extant, by the way, it was shown in theaters, before the main feature or whatever back home, and that had an effect. And why are they over there? Well, and what they've said about what's happening, for instance, when in 1914, when the Germans invaded Belgium and then into northern France, and things they had seen, and they couldn't be just discounted as British propaganda. And British propaganda was very effective. I mean, it was, but these were, our guys, and so it had. Again, I think it's incremental, but I think it's important. There's a lot of reasons why the United States ultimately went to war, of course, but I think it made a big difference.
Great, yeah. I mean, by the way, the bit, I guess, in the second half of the book talking about flying was one of my favorite bits of history reading I've had in a while. so thanks for that.
Thank you.
So I guess I'd like to move to talk about you a little bit. A lot of our listeners for BookStory, and then a lot of our viewers for BookStory are also teachers. A lot of them are history teachers. So I was curious, because you are a professor at NYU, but I guess mainly you teach high school history. And what is your experience writing a book, especially like a history book, when involving this much research, balanced with working full time, doing that?
Well, first of all, let me say with NYU, when the book came out, I was still on staff as an adjunct instructor at NYU. But I haven't picked up any classes in a couple of years, so I would strike that from my resume. But I'm more than willing to pick up a class if I can. But it's not that was something that I was doing at the time, and that's not something I'm doing right now. In terms of being a high school history teacher, I think in some ways it's sort of practicing what we preach, in the sense that we want our students to look at documents. We want them to think for themselves, and we want them to write, and we write with some conviction, and we want them to apply what they're learning. And so in some ways it's just expanding on what we do as teachers, what we're teaching our students. It's a passion too. I think it's important that you have to really care about what you're writing. For me, it's not a dry exercise. I think if I found a topic that I felt that I didn't feel that way about, I think I would abandon it. I don't think I'd want to move forward with it, even if it was something that I had spent a lot of time on. So I think that's important. And then managing time. Teachers are fortunate in that they do have big chunks of time during the year where they're not expected to be at school. So you have, the breaks and so forth, and then of course the summer. And so using that time, setting out a plan. Look, I'm going to write 10,000 words over February break. And then you have to do it. I mean, it's, you have to, you're your taskmaster. You have to force yourself to meet these deadlines. And it helps having an understanding spouse or significant other. And my wife's been wonderful in this regard, because it's a lot of late nights, and it can that can be trying sometimes. But she's been wonderful, so I've been fortunate in that regard. And I think also, in terms of the publishing side of it, I think it's really important to have an agent. And I know today with the platforms for self-publishing and so forth, it's really the democratization of the publishing industry. And I know I actually have author friends who've gone that route, and it's worked out very well for them. But I think it helps when you have someone who understands how to navigate that world and is able to give you a platform to try to get what you're writing, what you're so passionate about, out there. Now, getting an agent to want to represent your work, that's not such an easy thing to do. You have to be willing, if you want to write, you have to be willing to accept rejection, because there's a lot of it. But it only takes one. If one agent likes what you're writing, or likes your topic, and thinks that it's something that they can sell, then that's all you need. And then, in terms of then the next, of course, the next would be a publishing house. So, the agent will go out there and represent your work, but you need, a publisher to bite to think, well, I think this will do. I think this is going to do well commercially, and so, and that's sort of an old-fashioned process, but I think that's the best way to go, because as a teacher, I have a full schedule. I'm preparing lessons. I'm grading essays. And it's various things. And so, meeting with students, parents. So if I can just focus on writing, I can do that, the research and the writing. But the other stuff, I think it really helps to have professionals. Mm-hmm. But I can give. This is something that you would probably, if you were interested in looking for an agent, you could probably find this advice elsewhere. But I know I can tell you what I did. I looked at books. I read a lot. And so I looked at books that I were sort of comparable in terms of the pacing, the way, the style, and so forth. And then I just went into the acknowledgments and looked for the agent. And okay, well, this person might be worth contacting. So I would try to get their contact information, and I would query them, and that's what I did. And one of them was Under the Banner of Heaven by John Krakauer. And so I just recently read that. And so I looked, and one of the agent was John Ware, and that was the person who eventually took me on and sort of introduced me to this, getting published and so forth. And he was formerly an editor at Harper's, which was also very helpful. because he helped me with my writing too. Unfortunately, he passed away from leukemia suddenly in 2013, and since I've been working with someone else. But that was how I started, and it was just querying, accepting rejection, and and eventually getting someone who's a professional to want to represent what I was doing and to give me advice, and I found that very helpful.
That's great. And we actually have a listener or a viewer question that has to do with high school history and also writing, but not the teachers, but the students. Jennifer asked, I also teach high school history classes, and I would love any tips on how to help my students become better writers. So, well,
the thing is of course, when we're having them write for us, a lot of times it's, I know it's like timed essays in class, sort of, particularly if you're teaching the AP curriculum, trying to get them ready for the exam in May. And similar with the IB actually too, but and so that model is really condensed. So I think having an effective thesis, so you having them, instead of trying to sort of, we need to get a thesis out there and sort of, to try to provide some direction and then get into the essay. I think having a thoughtful thesis and realizing that if the person knows essentially where you're going, and then you're going to lay out how I'm going to get there, and this is what I'm going to do, but I think that can be very effective. So it's paying attention to the thesis, I think, matters, I think, more than students realize. It was interesting because initially when you were asking me about the book, you said, well, this is sort of the things that, the premise of what I got from this book. And it was basically what I was trying to do. So, for instance, if you look at, say, the prologue to the book, the way that's set up, you should be able to read that and you pretty much know where you're going. And I think that students, that's an effective way, because a lot of times they have all this knowledge stored in their head, and how do I get it out? How do I, and also what to leave behind? There's a lot. If I had included everything that I had learned and read about, my book would have been much larger and messier and less cogent, and it would not have been as effective. And so, getting them to sort of think about that, so how do I, approach this so that I can make an argument that, makes some sense and is compelling, and I can take ownership of too. That's the other thing. Having their own opinions, I think, is important as well. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but again, I think direction. I think it's important. And then with research, I think particularly today, because there's so much out there, I think, and this is where I think librarians can play an important role. How do you sift through, all of this material that's available to us to try to get information that's going to help me, understand whatever it is I'm writing on, and I think that's an important skill to teach, because, again, because of the internet, we're so spoiled today. I look back at people who were doing what I'm doing, just to say, 25, 30 years ago. And it's like, it's, in some ways, I wouldn't know where to start with some of these things, and today we were very fortunate, but we have to, it also could be a curse in a sense. And I think helping students guide them through that, I think, is really important. And again, I think librarians can play an important role. They're a great resource.
Great. Thank you for taking that question. I'm sure Jennifer says thank you, although I'm not actually in touch with her directly. I think that's going to do it for today. Again, I'm talking to David Hanna. The book is called Rendezvous with Death, and it comes out on, let's say, November 12th. The book Rendezvous with Death comes out next month. Is that correct?
No, this book actually came out earlier. It was the 100th anniversary of Alan Seeger's death. So
Right.
it's not coming out. It's been out, and it's also available on Audible as well.
Awesome. As well as Amazon.com and elsewhere.
Yes.
All right. Apparently I'm good at reading for themes, but not for very specific details. But David, thank you so much. And take care.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye.